Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. We're going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes to get started. And yeah, we decided to also put on webcams today so you guys can see us actually. Yeah, I think it's a little bit nicer, a little bit more interactive. So yeah, let's get started in 1 or 2 minutes. I think we're going to wait another minute. I just saw like 2 people dropped out again. Maybe some technical issues. So let's wait another minute to get started.
Also, just as a heads up, I don't think we can see your webcam, Maria, at the moment.
Who's that for?
Maria.
Oh, Maria. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Got it now.
There we go.
It showed up for me in like a separate window, but I first had to approve it.
Fantastic.
Should we get started? I guess like a few more people will join, but I think we can get started with the introduction because that's similar to what we have done before. And yeah, welcome everyone. I'm really happy to see some familiar names here, but also some new ones. So yeah, great to have you on for this webinar session. As you can see, we decided to put the video on right now. We will only do that for the introduction, and then the Q&A session for the presentation, we will take it off for like better internet speed, etc. So yeah, we are at the 4th session of this webinar series about market entry and strategy. And today we're going to talk about navigating the policy landscape in emerging markets. And we're going to have a little bit of a focus on the Sub-Saharan African market, but if you have other questions to other markets, I'm sure we can also be able to answer those or come back to you with more insights. So Alba, I think you need to assist me to the next slide. Thank you.
Sure thing.
Great, and I think we can go to the next one. Yeah, exactly this one. So yeah, we are, or we were supposed to be actually at the end of this webinar series with this session, but due to demand from your side, we had a feedback on it. We decided to do actually another session, which is going to be in 2 weeks' time, and it's going to talk about B2B sales strategies in off-grid energy, because we covered a lot on the B2C side, but I think for a lot of you, B2B is actually more relevant right now. So yeah, we will do another webinar probably on the 16th of June, which I think is a Tuesday, so not a Thursday as we normally do it, in 2 weeks. So yeah, we would hope that you also going to attend this. For today's webinar, let me quickly introduce the participants. We have our experts, which is Dr. Rebekah Shirley. She is, and sorry, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Chief Research Officer for Power for All. And yeah, she's really a hallmark in this whole sector, has done a lot of different research, or has published a lot of different research topics, and has been a 2018 Outstanding Young Leader in Energy. So yeah, she knows the sector very, very well. And yeah, we are excited to have her on board, and she will explain a little bit more in her presentation about herself and also about Power for All's work. She will go into more details about the research they are doing, and especially focus on the policy parts. And then we have Nico Peterschmidt, who is the co-founder and managing director of INENSUS. And they are really a company that is private sector driven minigrid developer, as well as also working on support for the minigrid sector on the policy side, as well as on technical assistance and other topics. And I think Nico can go a little bit more into detail on that. We have been working together with them before on a program where, they were very much focused on supporting different country governments and policy leaders in developing minigrid policies, developing license agreements and these kind of things. So he will explain more about his work and go into detail on a few countries as well. And then we have Alp and me, who are the organizers of this webinar. And I guess you know us, so I'm not going to go into much detail on us anymore. Alp is working with Carbon Trust and I'm with Energy for Impact. All right. We've been talking about this a couple of times already. Also we just stop the webcam because we want to have you guys to have good internet connections. So we're going to leave it out now for the presentation, and then we're going to put it on again for the Q&A session. Quick overview again about you, the participants. So we have 53 companies that receive funding under the Energy Catalyst rounds 3 to 6. And we have really diverse sector representation. We try to cover most of these sectors in our presentation and try to really make this relevant for all of you. But obviously, given that it's very broad and focused on a lot of different topics, from bioenergy to solar mini grids to storage related topics, etc., software for the sector, please do let us know if you have specific questions. So I think I don't need to go into much more detail here. On the next slide, we have a short explanation around how you can ask questions. So quickly to remind you, you can post the question in this question tool in this box that you see on the control panel. So just type it in there and then we will answer during the Q&A session after the two presentations. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand, which is this little symbol here on the side of your control panel, and we can then unmute you, or you can unmute yourself, which I think should also be possible. All right, then let's jump right in with Rebekah's presentation.
Great, thanks. Can everyone see those slides all right? Good.
Yeah, I think it should
great.
Be fine,
well, Great, thanks so much for that introduction, Maria. Hi, everybody. My name is Rebekah. I'm the Chief Research Officer at Power for All. Just want to take a quick moment to thank you, Maria, the Energy for Impact team, the Carbon Trust team, for the opportunity to speak with all of these attendees. I really hope that everybody is safe and sound wherever you're dialing in from today. And as you can see from the title of the talk, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about a study that we did recently on policies for catalyzing decentralized renewable energy markets. And I'm going to be specifically looking at some of the top markets in the sector right now between Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. This looks a little bit, it's on black, but either way, let me just say a quick note about Power for All. So we're an awareness-raising nonprofit that's focused on delivering clean, reliable, and affordable power to all, as the title implies. And we focus on countries with low energy access, like most in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where the challenge is really in serving rural and peri-urban communities. So we were established as a group of practitioners and have now evolved into a coalition of 300 plus partners, as you're seeing on this slide, that all believe that traditional grid extension pathways need support from newer, more modern solutions, many of which you in the audience are representing. So our goal is to encourage that integration, and we do that in 3 ways. Helping to unify the beyond the grid community, to advocate for specific enabling policy. That's number 1. Number 2, we also help to catalyze markets for decentralized energy technologies by mobilizing key stakeholders on the ground. And I'm going to say a little bit about that later. And then number 3, We support awareness raising and evidence building by producing research and data that's 100% open access to help people, whether you're a policymaker or a journalist, understand the impacts of access and practical solutions for delivery. So that's where I come in as the Director of Research. So as I mentioned, you can skip on to the next slide. Rather than seeing
Rebekah,
centralized,
sorry.
yes.
I just realized, like, I think the first 2-3 slides are a little bit, for some reason, lost a little bit the format, but the other ones look fine again. I'll change that later.
Oh,
Apologies
that's
to everyone.
okay. No, that's not a worry. That's not a worry. As long as they can see the logos, and I'm sure some of the audience maybe are even in that logo slide, so no problem at all. But where was I? Oh yes, I was saying. So as I'd mentioned before, from our point of view, rather than seeing centralized and decentralized technologies as separate pathways for separate challenges, we find that, and we try to promote solutions for integrated approaches to energy as a service, with the belief that integration will really lead us to this more reliable grid that offers lower cost and faster access. Even the IEA is now saying that integration is the future. If you take a look at this slide, what you see is that, now note here that even 4 years ago, the IEA didn't include decentralized renewables in their modeling framework at all. And now what we're finding is that at the current pace, universal energy access won't be achieved by 2030, and we're going to fall short by about 650 million people. In order to reach that goal by 2030, what the IEA's latest modeling shows is that half of those new connections, more than half actually, would have to come from decentralized technologies. So that's what you can see on the left-hand side here. So this means an additional investment to the tune of, I think they said 28 US billion per year is going to be required, and obviously more focus on decentralized technologies. Next slide. So that said, we're saying that we need specific focus on solutions for rural electrification, including specific inclusion of decentralized technologies, but this is often not commonly reflected in national policy. On this slide, what you're seeing is the results of a comprehensive study that our team did a few years ago, where we scoured government documents to identify energy access targets country by country across sub-Saharan Africa. And South Asia. We also looked at Latin America and the Caribbean. And what we found was that, in fact, 73% of low energy access countries, so when I use that phrase, I'm talking about countries where less than half of the rural population has access to electricity. We found that 73% of those countries don't have decentralized renewable energy targets, as you can see if you add up the gray and the blue. And more than a third of them don't have national energy access targets at all. So that's saying a lot about where sort of the state of play is right now. Let's move on to the next slide. So there's this broad agreement on the need for integration of decentralized technologies, but as you could see from the slide before, few actual targets. If low energy access countries are going to establish frameworks that quickly catalyze the development of these types of technologies in country, the question then is, what are the most critical elements of an early stage policy portfolio? And what is that policy formula, let's say, for jumpstarting the sector? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We found through literature review that there are actually very few studies that take a quantitative approach to asking this question about policy. So we did a simple study to answer this very, very practical question, and I'm going to share the method and the results with you right now. Next slide. Great. So let me tell you a little bit more about our process and then describe our results. In this study, we presented a two-tiered empirical analysis of the 5 most active decentralized renewable energy markets in the world. Those 5 were Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, India, and Bangladesh. So we've got the spread from East Africa and South Asia. We looked at these countries, as I said, because they're the 5 most active DRE markets in the world, and we took best available data to provide a practical insight into how you can prioritize policy for low energy access countries. So let me jump back a minute. What do I mean by two-tiered? Essentially, there were 2 steps here. We took a top-down and a bottom-up approach. from the bottom up, we first surveyed a sample of decentralized renewable energy companies, like you all in the audience, operating in these markets to identify the policies and regulations that have been most influential for their companies operating locally. So that real-world insight provides a strong message for policy priority. Then the second thing we did was top-down. We observed the correlation between policy performance and market growth in a quantitative way for these top-performing countries. And we found the statistically significant relationships. Now, interestingly, what we found is that the top-down and the bottom-up correlate really well and show us where some key policy levels are in terms of opening up these kinds of markets. So let me just start with that top-down part of the study, and then I'll explain the second half. Essentially, when we talk about policy, we oftentimes don't have very good statistical information about how well policies perform. So what we did in this study is we observed the correlation between policy performance indicators and decentralized renewable energy market growth for those 5 countries that I mentioned before. And we used 2 estimates for market development. One was cumulative sales of quality verified solar lighting products, which represents market size. And the other was the number of dairy companies in operation in those 5 countries, which represents the market activity. So, you know, those are both conservative estimators, obviously, since solar lighting product sales don't incorporate, you know, the energy service provision for minigrids and other DRE systems and so on. And also the number of active companies doesn't factor in the size of those companies. So obviously there's some caveats here. But that said, you know, we're using the best available information to approximate market size. Then to quantify policy performance, what we did is we took BNEF's, that's Bloomberg's Clean Energy Investment Climate Assessment Tool, which I think some of you are probably familiar with. It's called ClimateScope. And ClimateScope is an interactive report and index that basically evaluates the policy and investment climate for clean energy investment across the developing world. So we selected all of their energy policy indicators for this assessment, and those included indicators on clean energy policies, power sector structure, distributed energy regulatory frameworks, rural electrification policies, energy access policies, and also I think policy barriers, meaning like import tariffs and so on, and then loan grants, grant programs, local investment, and the number of green microfinance institutions. And then those climate scope indicators were normalized to the % value of the maximum country score awarded for any indicator. Let me show you what I mean by that in the next slide. Great. So to illustrate the correlation between the subset of policy indicators that I just listed for you and the DRE market development, which I just described how we're approximating market development, we use the least squares linear regression approach that allows us to measure performance. So using that method, what you're seeing here is the slope of a positive correlation that can be defined as increased market growth or development per % increase in policy performance score. So to measure how closely those data points actually fit a regression line, we took R-square values, and that's provided with each plot. I haven't shown those here just to not confuse things, but if needed, we can always share the full report after for those of you who are interested more in the stats. So what you're seeing in this slide is the correlation between policy performance, that's what's on the x-axis, and sales. And what you can see super clearly here is that 5 key policy performance indicators have a very strong and very positive correlation to increased sales. When we unpack those specific policy measures, we actually find that there are particular policy interventions that all the top performing countries have actually undertaken that contribute to those high scores and therefore influence the strength of the correlation. For instance, with regard to regulatory frameworks, as you can see here, that's a very that's a very strong one here. We found that all of the top performing countries have established mini-grid licensing requirements and have adopted technical quality standards for both products and services. So that corresponds to what we found in the survey, which I'm going to come to in just a second. Just as another example, if you look at the energy access policy line, also very strong and positive. All of the top performing countries we found had energy access targets That's defined as a national level commitment to energy access. And they also had active rural electrification programs. And again, you're gonna see this corresponding to what we found from the survey respondent side of this. So essentially, we found some other high performance areas, including tax reductions, the availability of mobile money, the removal of barriers to operating as a retailer, and unpacking those indicators just showed us that there are a number of policy areas which are still lacking even in the top performing countries. Most importantly, tariff deregulation and the provision of connection grants for customers. So next slide. So now let me take you to the empirical side of the study. So what I just described for you was the top down, right? We did a correlation study using best available data. And now I'm going to show you the empirical side of the study, which is the survey that we extended to practitioners. And this was important so that we could understand their perspective. So we extended a survey to practitioners in the Power for All partner network that are currently operating in either one or more of those 5 countries that I mentioned. This turned out to be 23 companies. There were 11 in solar home system sales and PV products, 5 in minigrid and microgrid services, and then 7 that did both. So we got quite a bit of a spread. And together, these are very high-performing companies. So they actually catered to, I think, 2.7 or 2.8 million households, if I remember correctly. So we asked participants to rank a specific subset of policy instruments within 3 groupings. 1, national energy policy. 2, technical regulation. And 3, financial regulation rather. And we basically asked them to rank a set of policies, and you can see here, for instance, with the national energy policy, what those look like on the left-hand side. We asked people to rank those according to how important or beneficial the respective instrument has been or would be in supporting their local business operation. And they were asked to explain their choice for number 1 so that we could get some qualitative understanding of their reasons why. We basically then just calculated the average ranking of each policy instrument in its grouping. What you're seeing here is the example for national electrification policy. But again, I just didn't want to provide too much information up front. So again, we can always share this report later. Based on the survey, what we found was that the most influential national energy policy instrument is the presence of specific off-grid or decentralized renewable energy penetration targets and timeframes. They said that the timeframes are really important. So this has both the highest average ranking of the group, as you can see here, and it also had the most number 1 rankings of the group, as you can also see here. Just as some verbatim, one respondent explained that DRE penetration targets help to communicate a clear action and commitment from governments and allow for relatively accurate forecasting of future growth potential, which all of you know as practitioners is usually very difficult to do. However, we found that while 50% of companies that only sell solar home system products targeted this as number 1, 75% of the minigrid companies ranked electrification plans that specifically integrate decentralized renewables as their number 1 policy. So either way, it's really about having those plans and having a specific call out in those plans for decentralized renewable energy technologies and timeframes. As I said, I'm not gonna show the technical regulation and the financial policy one, but just suffice to say, with respect to technical regulation, what we found is that clear and low-cost permitting and licensing regimes for decentralized renewable energy owners and operators, along with adoption of internationally recognized product quality standards and performance reporting requirements, were easily the 2 most important regulatory measures that were mentioned. And then with respect to finance, we found that companies were basically agreed on the most important measure. This was exemption from import tariffs on DRE products, and that easily dominated the subgroup with 50% of the number 1 rankings and also the highest average ranking. Across each subgroup, the standard deviation was pretty small, I think less than 5% each. So this says that although there are some number 1s, as I was just calling out, it actually means that there are all of the other policy instruments in the grouping are seen as very important as well. So in sum, what are we saying here? Basically, what we can draw as conclusion here is that there are a couple of key policy intervention levers for successful in these highly successful decentralized renewable energy markets. National energy policy, it's important to have established targets and to integrate decentralized renewables into national electrification planning. From a technical point of view, internationally recognized product quality standards are critical for establishing and instilling market confidence. And then streamlined licensing and permitting is most significant as a barrier to entry for mini-grid operators. And then finally, in terms of finance, the single most effective financial measure that governments can put in place to catalyze these kinds of markets is to remove import duties and tariffs on dairy products. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to wrap up in a little bit. Great. So this exercise of both observing the correlation between quantified policy performance and market size indicators, as well as looking at the practitioner perspective, helps us understand and corroborate the findings of both sides of the equation. And deconstructing those 5 policy performance indicators that had the strongest correlation that I showed you in the slide before, or the 2 slides before, we basically find that there's some key highlights, some key very important market accelerators for governments in low energy access countries. Here we see them. Number 1, reduction of import duties and tariffs, as I mentioned before, was across the board seen as important and also statistically correlating to market expansion. Number 2, supporting the availability of local finance through loans, grants, and microfinance had a very strong correlation. Establishment of targets, as I mentioned, came up both in the correlation study and in the survey. Establishing rural electrification plans, and then technical regulation through quality control standards. So basically, you can see how a quantitative approach lands us on those key policy interventions for catalyzing dairy markets. Let me just say before we round out that the study, of course, has some limitations in terms of the market metrics I mentioned before, in terms of the policy performance proxies, and in terms of the sample size. Most importantly, though, these are snapshots of present policy performance, and even where those are historically informed, they can't be used to fully explain past market development. By that, I'm just simply meaning that causal relationships cannot be inferred through correlatory methodologies. So correlation doesn't prove causation, as you've probably all heard. That said, you know, either way, beyond the establishment of a policy, there are always other factors at play: the capacity to implement a policy, the quality of that implementation, and of course, the political will for enforcement. So all of that's to say, while we can identify quantitatively important policies, the real work comes afterwards in terms of implementing those policies. Let's just go to the next slide. So using that framework, we issued calls to actions with our country partners in our 3 campaign countries at the time: Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria. And the calls to action basically took that research and focused on the targets, the integrating electrification strategies, and the establishment of task forces. And those calls to action led to very notable commitments across each country. So for instance, just to give a concrete example, after this call to action, in working with the Sierra Leone government, they basically established a multi-stakeholder energy revolution task force with Power for All serving as the coordinator to develop policy and finance ecosystems that were needed to build out the decentralized renewable energy sector. That task force was called the Energy Revolution, and it had very tangible impacts. Just to name a few, in less than 2 years, we found that the market in Sierra Leone had grown by 900%. Yes, it's 900%, with imports of solar home products going from 2,000 in the first half of 2016 to more than 20,000 by the end of 2017. Also, a VAT exemption for solar home products was fast-tracked, and a streamlined green lane process was implemented for rapid product clearance through customs, which basically reduced the delays of getting things through customs from 6 to 8 weeks to 5 days. And then the task force also launched an awareness campaign that resulted in significant improvement in the volume and tone of media coverage of minigrid and solar home system products. And the number of stories went up 11 times over the period of 2 years. And then finally, we were able to attract a number of international companies to come and take up, do work in Sierra Leone, showing the ability of these kinds of policy mechanisms to really create an enabling space. So I'm talking about like Total, Azuri, Greenlight Planet, Delight, Bbox, Ignite, Barefoot Power, all were able to come in and facilitate the creation of the country's first ever private sector industry body. And now there is a Renewable Energy Association of Sierra Leone. So I just bring this up to show that when we talk about policy intervention, they can really lead to very tangible impacts, and we can actually see market growth happen in real time on the ground. Just my last two slides, I want to just, if you slip to the next one, I think hopefully you get a sense from this of some of the key policies that can be implemented to open up markets. And since that study, we've done even more extensive research into filling this gap around integrated approaches. Some of you might have been parts of this webinar that we held yesterday. I was just telling Mary and Alp about it before the call. Essentially what we've done is we've launched an entire campaign around integration as a coalition, and our first exploration of how exactly to design business models for integration is currently being conducted in Uganda. So we just had a webinar on this yesterday. I can obviously share our calls to action, our reports, our data on this if it's interesting to anybody, and sort of who, those who might want to hear more about what are we finding in terms of the business models that actually allow for this kind of integration. So that's one thing that's ongoing. And my last slide, if you just skip down, is another thing that comes up very often from the companies, and we hear this all the time through surveys at Power for All, is the challenge of the state of the workforce, the size and the state of the workforce. So in 2018, we launched the Powering Jobs campaign and recently published journal articles that demonstrate the linkage between workforces and being able to strengthen dairy markets, and conversely, how strong dairy markets can create job opportunity. And there's a lot of policy that also goes into developing and growing a workforce for the sector. So that did not come through in the study that I showed you before, but I just wanted to bring this up, that we've done a whole entire body of work around how to build the workforce around the sector, because that's also a very important component of creating an enabling environment. So I think there's just one last slide. Yeah, so just to say thank you for the opportunity to chat. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. And again, as I said, we can share any of the materials that were presented here that might be interesting to the participants. So thanks, Mary. I will let you take back over from here.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rebecca. This was really great. I think very informative. And yeah, please do post your questions in the chat box if you have any for Rebecca. And then we will go over now directly to Nico's presentation, INENSUS presentation. And yeah, we will have a Q&A session afterwards.
All right, thank you, Maria. Yeah, thanks for the introduction earlier. Let me talk like a minute about myself and my company. I'm the Managing Director of INENSUS. INENSUS is a consultancy company. We, on the one hand, work for the mini-grid sector, mini-grid developers, mini-grid operators, but a large part of our job is designing policy frameworks in collaboration with governments. We, for example, have supported the Nigerian government in designing the mini-grid framework, as you can find it right there. In Sierra Leone, we have finalized the job. In Myanmar, we are still working on the policy design, and we are basically in the middle of the work in Ethiopia and in Mozambique and other countries. So having said that, well, we are consultants, right? Which doesn't mean that governments always do what we tell them, what we think should be best, or what we tell them to do, but they often take their own measures and then do exactly the opposite of what we recommend. But anyway, I think I have developed a relatively good understanding of how governments think and what they believe needs to be done from their point of view to make policies work. And then, of course, we can tell them what the private sector thinks about it and how these two can find their way to finally come to a conducive framework for both sides. Next slide, please. This presentation is on the policy frameworks. Like, we will start off with the inherent risks to mini-grids. How can policy regulation help to, well, remove the risks or to mitigate the risks? Then we will discuss, or I will introduce mainly some regulatory frameworks in sub-Saharan Africa and come up with some key takeaways. Next slide, please. This is the figure which many of you probably have seen. It comes from the Minigrid Policy Toolkit, which was designed by my company in 2014. It basically shows where the minigrid space is, and that is where minigrids have lower cost of electricity than solar home systems and the main grid. So, and there are various curves, cost curves, from small sites to large cities, from individual households to highly populated areas. There is a space where minigrid definitely can provide the best, or provides the best solutions for electricity supply, especially, that is what this diagram does not show that clearly, where productive use of electricity is required. That is where minigrids have their specific strength. Next slide, please. So now, for now, it's like the minigrid sector has evolved over the last decade, I would say, especially, and has developed certain models under certain policy frameworks. But so far, there is relatively little evidence for really successful and scalable private sector-driven minigrid businesses. And this is something that we all now have to work on, you as the innovators of the sector, and we as the consultants, and of course the policymakers on the other hand. Whereas you can develop new and innovative business models which may increase profits, we will do the work on the framework and try to reduce the risk, so that increased profits and reduced risks may at the end results in a constellation where minigrid can acquire finance and then be rolled out in the large scale. Next slide, please. Here are the risks that minigrid companies have to face, and there are internal risks and external risk. The internal risks inside the pot on this slide are the demand or volume risk, the load pattern risk, and the overspending technical underperformance risk. Let me just introduce quickly like what these three risks are. The demand risk is basically, well, when you go to a site and you size your system, the system size cannot be changed easily after some time. But when you start setting up your system, you do not know exactly how the demand, electricity demand, will develop over time. And in many cases, the electricity demand does not develop as fast as expected, which means that the system is oversized, and in an oversized system, the economics and the profitability doesn't work out as expected. The same happens if the system is undersized and you potentially need to then integrate a diesel generator, and the diesel generator burns a lot of fuel. Then at the end, your financials may not work out either. Similarly, the load pattern risk. Like when you start off your system, you usually come up with an idea of how the daily load profile may look like. Like, for example, with a peak during evening hours and another peak during morning hours, or whatever it may look like. And then you design your system accordingly, usually using computer simulation software. But what happens if this peak is in reality is different from what you expected initially? So then suddenly your battery storage may be too small or too large, and at the end your financials don't work out properly anymore. And then the last internal risk is the overspending versus technical underperformance risk. So now the question is, how much money do you spend on maintenance of your assets? If you spend a lot of money, you probably have well-working systems, hopefully, but at the end, the high expenditure on the OPEX side may reduce your profitability. On the other hand, if you underspend on the OPEX side, then your systems may not perform, and at the end, you cannot deliver your product, which is electricity, to your customers, which also has a bad negative result on your financial stability. So these are the internal risks. And then there are external risks like what happens when the main grid comes and connects to your system. How bureaucratic are tariff and license regulations? What is the cost of capital, and what is the stability of your regulatory and policy framework? Next slide, please. So now the question is, how can policy mitigate all these internal and external risks? Well, on the one hand, there is on the upper left corner the well-designed tariff and license regulation, which can, for example, open up for time of use tariffs, which can influence on the load pattern to make sure that the load pattern is like you incentivize people to use the load as you had expected initially by like charging a higher or lower tariff during certain times of the day. Then the tariff adjustment options need to be there in case of the demand increasing on the productive use side, or let's say demand not being as expected on the productive use side, and your financials really looking very bad, then you may go back to the regulator and ask for a higher productive use tariff, so that the existing productive users will cover your cost. This is not given in all the regulations and all the policies throughout the countries that we will talk about later, but many of them have actually taken that into consideration. Then, well, tariffs being cost reflective is a very important issue that needs to be reflected in regulation. Then on the right-hand side, funding programs. How can funding programs affect these risks? Let me just jump over it and go to the next slide. And then we'll have a look into various countries and see how these countries have actually taken into consideration all these aspects that mitigate the risks of the private sector. And we have a look into, for each of these countries, into from top to bottom, clear policy targets, same as in the last presentation, kind of, suitable licensing schemes, tariff regulation, arrival of the grid, and public funding programs. And here we have the example of Nigeria, which is one of the examples, a relatively large country with a relatively private sector friendly policy and regulation, with relatively well-defined targets, with a relatively nice entry stage for small mini grids where you don't need to go through the full licensing procedure, up to 100 kilowatts of distributed power in your mini grids, at cost reflective tariff regulation, and the arrival of the grid regulation, where and that is very important, the negotiation power in case of the main grid arriving at the mini grid is with the mini grid operator. So you will also see later in the presentation countries where they introduced an arrival of the grid's regulation, but where the negotiation power is rather with the utility than the mini grid operator, and where then like usually in the utility would negotiate the minigrid operator down. But in Nigeria, this is not the case, because there is an obligation for a compensation from the distribution network operator to the minigrid operator in case of main grid arrival. And then there is an open funding program, which is relatively large, $150 million in Nigeria. Next slide, please. Sierra Leone is also a very interesting example, also relatively open to the private sector, but a very small country, and therefore the willingness to adjust the framework towards the private sector requirements is a little bit more limited than in the large country of Nigeria, because the policy changes always cost the government a lot of money, and therefore as where resources are constrained, even the government says, okay, well, let's do what is really necessary, but let's not go into all the details. And that is a very typical behavior of a small country. Next slide, please. Tanzania is one of the examples where they had a relatively nice start, but they didn't go the full length of mini-grid regulation implementation. So at the end, they set up a regulation in Tanzania with a cost-reflective tariff and some exclusive rights for the mini-grid operator and a compensation for, like in case of main grid arrival, to the mini-grid operator. But where the utility has got a very strong lever to, well, in case of main grid connection, at the end, determine the conditions. And that is, of course, from a mini-grid perspective, not really wanted. Another aspect here is, and that what you will also see in many other countries, is the tariff regulation setup. Where you have a cost-reflective tariff setting methodology anchored in regulation, but when it actually comes to actual tariff regulation, then policy comes into play. And even though the calculation methodologies of the regulator determine a higher tariff, then the policymakers say, no, but this is not acceptable. So at the end, there is a discrepancy between the regulation and the actual implementation. And unfortunately, this is the case for most countries in Africa, but also in many countries in Asia still. Please, next slide. Kenya is somehow similar, also cost-reflective tariff, but a very strong expectation regarding the tariff level. The regulation for mini grids is still not approved, although it's being readily drafted. This is also a very much political approach and a political process that still is ongoing. Nice funding programs in Kenya, still ongoing. I think there are still some opportunities out there. Next slide, please. Uganda is an interesting country where we will see a lot of developments probably in the coming 1 or 2 years with some funding, interesting funding programs coming up. Whereas Uganda on the tariff side has stated a relatively clear expectation that the tariffs must be below $30 per kilowatt hour. It's not written anywhere, but it's basically, it has been said and it has been noted by the sector, and therefore the regulator will not approve anything else anymore. Next slide.
Nico, just a short reminder that probably if you can wrap up maybe in like 2 or 3 minutes, the rest of the question would be great. Thanks. Well, Senegal is an interesting example where the country started off with a relatively private sector friendly approach and then moved towards a more government oriented approach. Nowadays, mini grids are mainly operated through EPC, engineering, procurement, and commissioning, construction commissioning contracts, and then the like paid for by governments through bilateral loans, sovereign loans from international donors or banks.
and then are handed over to the concessionaires, which are in charge of larger areas in the country. Next slide. So let's jump Mali and Zambia quickly. Next slide, please. So this is a quick evaluation of the regulatory frameworks in various countries. You can review it later, I guess. Next slide. So the key takeaways from my point of view and the work that we have performed over the recent years is if you want to assess how ready a country is for minigrid, large-scale minigrid implementation, you probably have to look at the level of the consensus on, let's say, the national consensus on tariff levels versus subsidy levels. So at the end, the government has to decide and has to be supported by their voters on the decision of what tariff levels to accept, what is politically acceptable and what can be implemented. It's usually not the regulators that set the tariffs at the end, it's usually the policymakers that have the strongest influence. And then, of course, if the government expects a relatively low tariff, then the subsidy levels must be adequate and support these low tariffs. And well, in many countries, you will see that this debate has not come to an end. Even in Nigeria, this debate is still ongoing. And tariff levels from a policy perspective are still too high in mini-grids, and subsidy levels are still too high in mini-grids. And yeah, so at the end, when you go into a new country, just have a look at this aspect. How far have they come with this kind of national consensus? At the end, once this consensus has been taken, policy and regulation can minimize inherent external and internal risks in mini-grids. And that has got a very strong catalyzing effect on the mini-grid sector in general. And last but not least, many frameworks for mini-grids in Africa and also in Asia are moving into the right direction. But due to the lack in the national consensus on tariff levels versus subsidy levels, many of these frameworks are not reliable. They can change at any time. Even if something is written in regulation, it may, like policy influence, may still change the final decision of a regulator. And that is happening every day. So, and this is the current stage of the mini-grids, well, regulatory and policy sector in Africa, at least in parts of Asia. Thank you.
Right. Thanks a lot, Nico. This has been very helpful. And yeah, I think you had a few more slides, but everyone can take a look at that in hindsight, if that's relevant for you. So let's go over to the Q&A session. And yeah, maybe we can turn on our videos again quickly so you can see ours. Let me just pose the first question. We had a question coming in by email from Trevor Hardcastle from Frontier Technical. What are the challenges associated with feeding additional energy into a mini-grid? So Nico, I think this is best for you to answer.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Interesting question indeed. There are various cases that you have to distinguish here. I understand this question as a third party feeding electricity into another party's mini-grid, which the other party can be the public utility, or it can be another private sector mini-grid operator. In case of it being a private sector mini-grid operator, in most countries, you are allowed to do so if you agree with the private sector mini-grid operator. But I guess that in most countries, mini-grids are, like private sector mini-grids are relatively small, and the mini-grid operators would probably be hesitant to allow third parties to feed into their networks. What you need from a regulatory point of view in most countries is a generation license, depending on how large your generation capacity is. A different case is the operation or the feed-in of electricity into a distribution network, mini distribution network that is operated by a public utility. these mini grids can be significantly larger, diesel-operated mini grids of several megawatts, for example. In this case, it is relatively common to have third parties, IPPs, kind of introducing electricity to these networks to make them hybrids. Usually these sectors are relatively well regulated, and you will find the respective requirements in that respective regulation. Usually it's an open process, a competitive bid that you have to go through. In most cases, it doesn't make sense to approach the utilities directly because they are bound to open bidding processes. So far, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. I think this has been a very comprehensive answer to the question. But if there should be anything outstanding, I'll give you more information later how you could get more support from us. Another question from Bijan Yadolahi to Rebekah. Does your top-down and bottom-up approaches take into account social acceptance barriers as well? And if so, in what context? Oh, Rebekah, we can't hear you right now. I think you're muted.
Sorry, yes, I was just saying that's a great question. Social acceptance, from the practitioner point of view, I think we were just asking for this particular set of policies how it affected the practitioners themselves. So if you're meaning social in terms of more broadly, no, and also for the policy indicators, the policy proxies that come through ClimateScope, social acceptance isn't one of their performance metrics that they're scored on. So quantitatively, no, social acceptance hasn't been included in the study. Although, I think it's important to acknowledge, just as Nico was saying just a bit earlier in the slides, that there is, policymakers are, they have to think about sort of their constituency, and so it's definitely an important topic in terms of ensuring that a policy is acceptable by that set of constituents, especially when we're talking about things like tariffs, import duties, subsidy. So that's a really, really important point, but it's one of the limitations for sure.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. And yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up. Oh no, we have one more question just coming in from Martin Bellamy. So maybe we can answer that very shortly. How does reliability or at least predictability of supply factor into policy discussions? Who of you would like to take that one?
I think what I would say to that, and then I'm sure Nico, as the mini-grid person, probably has thoughts to add in here. I think that reliability, especially, one of the slides that we didn't get to was the Uganda, and we kind of had to whip through that one. But I can just speak to that since we're doing work directly in Uganda right now. And reliability is across the board for utilities in sub-Saharan Africa a major challenge. We see loss rates of upwards of 40% very regularly. So I think that reliability is a really important feature, and oftentimes you can see regulators that have tied the tariff to reductions in losses. And so there are ways that you can sort of, in a policy framework, bring reliability into the way that policy is designed, and make that sort of a KPI for utilities and for other developers as well.
Yeah, well, on the mini grid side, reliability is of course a very prominent aspect, because mini grids, as I said before, are mainly applied where you want to use electricity productively, where you want to run machines, where you want to run businesses based on electricity supply. And these businesses, of course, can be more profitable and provide their customers better if electricity is reliable. Policy actually does not, from my experience, does not take reliability into consideration so much. But when you go to the, let's say, higher policy, if you go down to the local level, then reliability plays more of a role. Like the higher policy levels usually want to have as many people electrified as possible, which with whatever tier of electricity supply available. Yeah, but when you go on site and talk to the people that are then related to their local policymakers, that is where reliability plays a significant role. Unfortunately, I would say it's not on the higher policy levels.
Okay, thanks a lot for this these answers. We had one more question coming in. I'm not sure whether everyone has a few more minutes, maybe, so we can quickly answer that. Do you think we should answer it now, or should we take it? Should we answer it separately after the webinar?
We can hang on for a few more minutes to get the answer, and so that the people watching the recording can benefit from that as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good idea. But yeah, if you have to drop out right now, please do answer the survey that pops up. It's very short. We just want to see your feedback. Any, anything that you think could be improved, or what else you would like to know about. So please fill that in. If you have a few more minutes, Stuart Crane had a question. To anyone who would like to answer. The 2018 Kenya Electrification Master Plan forecasts only 44,000 connections from isolated mini-grids from 6.4 million connections, less than 1% of the total after detailed geospatial analysis. Grid extension is about 17% and solar home systems is about 30%. Doesn't this mean there's no significant mini-grid market? Other studies for other countries are reaching similar conclusions.
Well, yeah, I take the question as what actually is the mini grid market? Yes, I agree that if you try to identify mini grid markets from a geospatial analysis perspective, the mini grid market may be fairly small. I completely agree with that, and there are probably not too many people from the sector that would agree here. But if you make the proper assumptions, then the portion of the mini grid market is relatively small. So, but I think the mini grid sector is slowly developing a new understanding of their task and their area, and that is really where there is economic and commercial potential, where there is an agricultural, where there are resources for agricultural businesses which are untapped. That is where the mini grid company goes in and provides electricity and sets up a business, and then not only supplies electricity, but especially then also runs this agricultural business. And the mini grid, the electricity supply, is only a driver, kind of a prerequisite for this other business, which is then the much larger revenue source, which is the much larger business. So, and now I believe that if you take that into consideration, the mini grid market is significant, and it's relatively large. You will probably not be able to detect that by geospatial analysis, but you have to go on the ground. You have to really analyze the resources available. You have to analyze the human resources available on site and so on, and then you will find your markets.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Oh, yeah, sure.
No, I was just going to add to that. There's a slide that I had in my deck that was showing the African energy outlook from the IEA as of November 2019. And what the IEA finds, looking at doing an optimization analysis in partnership with KTH for the entire continent, is that 31% of new connections across the continent would be coming from mini grids by 2030. So I think it kind of relates to what Nico was just saying about, it depends on how you're developed, what your basis is for thinking about the market. And it might point to some discrepancy between what is the actualizable market, if I could use that phrase, and what is actually in the local strategies.
Okay, great.
Could I just also squeeze in one question, which I think would be very useful for our participants, is for a startup that's thinking about market entry to a new country, what resources would you recommend for them with the policies that you've said are most relevant for the different technologies? Where should they look to determine which markets have those adequate policies or not?
I had exactly the same question, so thanks, Alp. That's great.
I think one first stop is obviously the industry. Oh, sorry. I was just a quick one from me. I think that one obvious first stop is the industry associations. So, you know, checking out the African Minigrid Developers Association, checking out GOGLA, checking out CLASP. They have a number of resources each that help to think about market potential. There's obviously some more pay for or behind paywall types of data that you can go to, but I think the industry associations, they're tasked with developing tools for thinking about you know, market estimates to support market entry.
Yeah, that is definitely good advice, Rebecca. In addition to that, if you want to do some internet research, I can advise you to just go to the Green Minigrid Help Desk that Energy for Impact and ENERSA developed together over the last years under a project from the African Development Bank. And there you will find a lot of policy documents, a lot of additional advice on how to set up mini-grids, what regulatory frameworks are available, and so on.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think those resources are definitely very helpful. And I know Power for All, for example, has very dedicated like country overview papers. So I really like them because they're pretty short. They're 2 pages. Very good. You get a very good overview. So that's definitely a great start. But then, yeah, the Green Minigrid helped us specifically for minigrid developers. And then if you have more questions specifically to a country that you are maybe interested in, or you are not a minigrid developer and you actually, for you, some other components might be more relevant, you can obviously contact us via the help desk. We are all doing that for you with regards to this help desk that we are setting up. And as always in our slides, maybe we can just quickly jump there. Alp.
And that's the Energy Catalyst help desk as opposed to the Green Minigrid help desk.
Exactly. Sorry. Yeah, this is the Energy Catalyst help desk, and this is for all of you, no matter what your solution is, where you can apply for more support. So if you need more information, if you need an overview of what's relevant for you and where a certain country maybe is standing on the policy side, please do apply here, and yeah, we can talk about it in more detail afterwards. Maybe you can quickly pull up the slide on the next for the next webinar. So as shortly mentioned, we are going to have the next webinar series, which wasn't initially planned, on the 16th of June, probably. The timing is not yet confirmed. We're going to send an email around for that. It's going to be about B2B sales in the off-grid energy market. And we're probably going to have someone from Schneider Electric speaking, because they are selling a lot B2B in several different markets. And I think it would be very interesting for a lot of you to hear how they are building their strategy and how they are doing their B2B sales. So yeah, thanks a lot everyone for attending this webinar. I hope this was useful to you. Please do provide us with feedback. Tell us if you have any other topics that you would like to have covered in future webinars, because otherwise we haven't planned anything else except for this next one. So if you have any other points, please do let us know, and then we can consider whether it makes sense to have another webinar session for everyone, or whether we're gonna support you separately on that. Okay, thanks a lot to Rebecca and Nico for the information. And
thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Right.
Thanks everyone.